Okay, folks, we are slowly coming back. Thank you for your questions. I would really like to finish at 7:30 this evening, which gives us about 50 minutes. And there's a couple of things that Roy really would like to cover, and I specifically would like Roy to cover applied critical realism, because applied critical realism will begin to make sense as how do we begin to use critical realism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the questions, and I'm going to invite Roy to deal with the questions that people have sent through on the beginning of the first session on the 24th of May. In that way, Roy can really dive deeply into some of the responses, and we can spend the rest of this evening dealing with the next aspects of basic critical realism. And I can see that Roy's ready to go. So thank you, Roy.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Yes, the next session, the first third or half even, will be on the questions arising from this section. We looked at the philosophy of science in general, transcendental realism. Now I want to turn more specifically to the philosophy of social science, critical naturalism. So when you look at social science, you can't make some of the assumptions that you can make in the case of the natural sciences. For example, about the independence of the intransitive world from the transitive world, and so on. And so it's best to look at it separately. In fact, the principle of immanent critique means that we can't just naively apply our findings from the philosophy of natural science to the philosophy of social science, because we must do an independent study as to what extent the two realms are in fact straightforwardly comparable. And so we start again afresh in the philosophy of the social sciences. And here we have to use again the principle of immanent critique. So I should have mentioned that the reason why I focused on experimental activity in my arguments in relation to natural science was because this was a premise that everyone agreed on. Empiricists, neo-Kantians, etc., all believed this was a very important feature. And it wasn't me importing my own standpoint into the philosophy of natural science. So in relation to the philosophy of social science and social theory generally, there was a feature which was almost undeniable, and that was that everywhere, wherever you looked, there were dualisms. So what were these dualisms? There was a dualism between structure and agency. There was a dualism between society and individual. There was a dualism between conceptuality or language and behavior or materiality. Then there was a dualism between mind and body, the dualism between reason and cause, the dualism between fact and value, and even the dualism between theory and practice. So the role of critical naturalism was to try and resolve these dualisms by giving a fairer account of the subject in question. So let me go through a few of these resolutions. let's take the old conundrum of structure and agency. What I said in my second book, The Possibility of Naturalism, was that structure and agency had been wrongly conceived, that a structure was always necessary for agency, and agency and at the same time, agency reproduced or transformed structure. So the sense in which structure is always necessary is a sense in which it always pre-exists any round of human agency. Because you can't engage in a speech act unless you have a pre-existing structure of language. You can't get married unless there's a pre-existing structure of marriage or family structure. And if you think about it deeply enough, you'll find that this is whatever act you're thinking of, it always presupposes the prior existence of structure. Therefore, structure always comes first when we're talking about agency and structure. But equally crucial is the fact that structure would not be ongoing. Structure, although always pre-existent, would not be ongoing without agency. If no one got married, if no one spoke, then the structures of marriage or family and of language would not survive. They would fade out. They would not be, language would not be a living one. And the practice of marriage or whatever would belong to the past. So the role of structure and agency that I defined in the transformational model of social activity involved the pre-existence of structure and the necessary continuity of structure through the reproduction, through being reproduced or transformed in agency. So that is the transformational model of social activity. Now, it is, at the time I wrote it, Anthony Giddens formulated his well-known theory of structuration. They were both published, as it happens, in 1979. And Tony Giddens invited me to lunch to a very nice restaurant in Greek Street, I think, in Soho, in London. And I think we both agreed that our models were very similar and mutually supportive. Then, over the years, a friend and colleague of mine, Margaret Archer, pointed out that this was not so. She said correctly that my model was very different from Tony Giddens's because of the central role that time plays in it. And for Tony Giddens, it's as if when you go to bed at night, the structure's back up. So, you know, you can imagine Don's in Cambridge College going to bed, and then in the morning they kind of reinvent the rules of the college. This may fit a college in Cambridge, but it doesn't fit most of social life. The most obvious fact of social life is the presence of the past. And this imposes an enormous constraint. If you look around the room you're sitting in, you'll see that the room is in a house which was built at a certain time, and the furniture belongs to a certain age, and you yourself, we are here talking about a problem of sociology. a problem that comes from the 19th century of structure and agency. So we are living in a world which largely we haven't created. And that means it is very difficult, unfortunately, for us radicals to transform the world in the way we want to. Of course, it doesn't mean that the world can't be transformed, but it just imposes a serious constraint on it. So Tony Giddens's model was too voluntaristic, if you like. And Margaret Archer's own model, which she calls the morphogenetic model, is a variant of the transformational model of social activity. Now, as the years from 1979 went by, I thought one could add something more to the transformational model of social activity in the conception I now call four-planar social being. And the idea of four-planar social being says that every event in the social world occurs simultaneously on four planes. The plane of material transactions with nature, the plane of social interactions between people, the plane of social structure sui generis, the economy, society, language, etc., and then, fourthly, the plane of the stratification of the embodied personality. And so that's an important development of coming out of the transformational model of social activity. Now, when we turn to the model, to the problem of society and individual, what was very fashionable at the time I wrote The Possibility of Naturalism was a doctrine known as Methodological Individualism, which asserted that the only real things in the social world were people, and that the rest of the other things, or seeming things that we referred to in social life, such as constitutions, armies, etc., could all be reduced ultimately to individuals and their properties. There was a tendency in social theory and philosophy of social science which was opposed to this, and they called themselves the methodological holists or collectivists. However, their paradigm of what wasn't individual was things like crowds and mass behavior. And this was very unfortunate, I think, because if you take an interesting social structure like a family or economy or a political constitution, you know, they're not at all like mass behavior, which seems to me to be a socio-psychological phenomena. And I argued that what both the holists and the individualists had got wrong was they failed to understand that society wasn't about individuals as such, nor was it about something opposed to individuals. Rather, what the social sciences were about were the persistent relations between individuals. That if you take my paradigm of a family as a sociological topic, what the family is concerned with is a relation between the parents, and between the parents and the children, and such like. And this gives the social sciences a distinct relational function. So I think this relationism, as it could be called, is a distinct advance on existing paradigms of the individual and the non-individual. However, in subsequent reflection, I qualified this a little bit because it gave the impression that the only legitimate object of social science were persisting relations. And I don't think this is correct. In fact, I think you can study social phenomena, and social phenomena are constituted at all of 7 levels at least. So taking this in terms of the smallest level first, there's the sub-individual level, which one thinks of the unconscious and motives. Then there's the individual level, the level at which a social theorist such as Sartre or novelists typically conceive the social world. Then there's the micro social world studied by ethnomethodologists, by Garfinkel, by the Goffmans of the world. Then there's the meso world of classical sociology, which studies the relation between functional types and roles, relations between capitalists and workers, or between management and workers, or management and shareholders, or owners, managers, shareholders, or between MPs and citizens. Then there's the macro social, which studies, you might study, for example, the Norwegian economy as a whole, or Norway as a whole. And then there's the mega level, in which your unit of study is whole swathes of space-time, in which you're concerned with things like the development of Islam or a feudalism. And then there's the planetary level, in which you're concerned with the world, the planet, or even outside the planet, solar system could be, as a whole. Anyway, world history is a topic that has recently been much in vogue, and that's taking the system, the world, planet as a whole, and stretching it back. So again, it's to try and introduce some complexity into the philosophy of social science. Now, taking the third of the dualisms, this was a dualism which was perhaps the sharpest in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It was a dualism which was expressed as an opposition between hermeneutics and positivism. So hermeneuticists argued that the world, that the social world was essentially linguistic. And if they were extreme, as most of them were, then that was all there was to the social world, language. By extreme, I mean Winch, Gadamer. If they were non-extreme, then they often combined this with, as Weber and Habermas did, with some elements of positivism. And now, where does critical realism stand on this? Critical realism stands firmly with those who argue that hermeneutics is essential. A social reality is conceptualized reality, but at the same time, that doesn't exhaust social reality, because social reality is also material. So, to understand the social world, we have to understand conceptual and material reality. So, when you're thinking about homelessness, then, of course, you're thinking about the application of certain concepts and how the human species has a concept of a home. But you're also thinking about the way in which people who are homeless don't have a roof over their heads and get wet and cold at night. And it's important to bear these two features of social reality in mind. So social reality is conceptualized, is dependent on conceptualization, but is not exhausted by it. And because of that, conceptualizations and the language we use can be criticized, subject to critique. Now, the mind-body dualism, we put forward a position which I call the synchronic emergent powers materialism. That is to say, we saw mind as an emergent power of body. In the case of the dualism between reasons and causes, we saw reasons as causes, as causally efficacious, and I put forward a theory of intentional causality. Now, I just want to say a brief word about the fact-value dualism. What critical realism sustained here was the idea of facts actually secreting values. The idea of being able to ground our evaluative positions in a scientific or factual account of the world. So what was essential to me here was the criticality of discourse. Because what happens when you're undergoing an education, or when you're having a discussion, whether it's an argument or just an exchange of an opinion with someone, is you're uttering a discourse, but this discourse is implicitly or explicitly critical. So when you learn the theory that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way round, when you begin to learn the heliocentric theory, then this is implicitly critical of all the Earth-centered views. When you see the Earth as curved, then this is implicitly critical of the idea that you can go in a straight line from one position 400 miles east and carry on walking until you eventually return to where you started. The important point here is to understand that in learning new beliefs and theories about the world, we are explicitly or explicitly discarding, changing, getting rid of our old beliefs and theories about the world. And it's not just our beliefs about the world that we're getting rid of. We're also implicitly critical of the actions informed by those beliefs. So when you have a new theory about what causes a particular problem, and you come to see that witchcraft, you come to revise your ideas of witchcraft and see that there aren't witches, and that therefore burning people as witches is wrong, then you'll implicitly change your, be critical of your actions and be logically bound to stop behaving in the way you did. So you move from having a conatus to change beliefs to having a conatus to change actions. And then, in the third step, you move to exploring what it is that causes beliefs and actions. And if you can say what it is about the social structure, or perhaps a psychic structure which produces a certain belief which is false, then ceteris paribus you have a negative valuation of that belief, or that's a system or structure, be it social or psychic or whatever. And that is the basis of the theory of explanatory critique, which I can't go into any further today, but which I developed in my third book, Scientific Realism and Human Emancipation. Now what I want to do for the last half hour or so is to talk a little bit about applied critical realism. This is critical realism apt for use in the open systems of daily life and practice. So the first thing, the first point to note here is that applied critical realism, any applied project is always, critical realist project is always doubly specific. That is to say, it's specific to the object you're trying to study, the ontology involved. And it's specific to where you are in your transitive dimension in terms of knowledge of that project. So there's no general method, there's only a specific method for specific objects given certain epistemological circumstances. So, you know, the theorem of the specificity, dual specificity of applied critical realist research is a paramount one. Now, my interest in this particular topic was my interest in terms of time taken thinking and working on it stemmed from my stay at the Institute of Disability Research in Örebro, Sweden, where I was a guest, and my host, Bert Danemark, my critical realist colleague, and I thought it would be a good idea to do some work on the very important topic of interdisciplinarity, which is where I came into it, and I'm going to say a little bit about it now. So when we turn to this topic of interdisciplinarity, and we were looking particularly at interdisciplinarity in disability studies, we found that in a way that a sort of reprise of what I had found when I started studying, when I started on my path to critical realism, because there was a lot written about the epistemology, and a lot of it quite sociologically intense and dense, of interdisciplinarity. But there was nothing about the ontology, nothing about whether there was something about the nature of the world which made interdisciplinarity necessary and useful. And of course there is, but this failure to ask the ontological question had resulted in a great mountain of literature with very little real substance or penetration to it. Now, if you start from a critical realist standpoint, then it will be immediately obvious that because you're dealing with phenomena that are produced in an open system, you're going to have to refer to one or more generative mechanisms or structures. By definition, it's only in a closed system that you have one structure or mechanism. In an open system, you always are dealing with what is produced by a multiplicity of mechanisms and structures. So you're always dealing with complexity. Then again, in open systems, you're always dealing, or mainly dealing, with mechanisms which operate at different ontological levels of reality. Some of them are human. Some of them are biological. Some of them are organic. Some of them inorganic. Then many of the human ones are social. And so you're dealing with various levels of emergence. So complexity and emergence of levels and indeed of outcomes are essential constitutive features of the ontology for interdisciplinary work. Now, when Bert and I started looking at interdisciplinarity in relation to disability studies, we found that disability studies had historically moved through three distinct stages. Thus, in the 60s, there was a dominance of the clinical paradigm, the medical model, in which basically disabilities were regarded as, well, let me put it like this, in which basically to have a disability was to have a physical and biological problem, and that was the end of it. There would be various ways of clinically treating or dealing with this problem. So naturally there was a reaction to this biological or clinical reductionism, and it came in the form of the so-called a social model, which was really an economic model, because in the later 60s and 70s, the argument was that there wouldn't be a problem of disabilities if the distribution of resources was right. If every room was accessible, there wouldn't be a problem for people who couldn't walk with their legs. And similarly with respect to other disabilities. And obviously this had the economic model had a good point against the clinical model, but you could ask, wasn't there a point in the clinical model as well, which should be retained? Anyway, by the 80s, a third model or paradigm arose, which was the cultural model. And this was a social constructionist paradigm, in which it was argued that really there wouldn't be a problem about disabilities if we all used the correct language and if we had the correct attitudes to it. And so the whole question of disability turned on another form of reductionism. So we had these three forms of reductionism, all of them touching a level of truth, but all of them being woefully reductionist. And in order to create a paradigm, an anti-reductionist paradigm, Bert and I took the concept of a laminated system, a concept which had been used by a critical realist friend of ours before us, Andrew Collier. And a laminated system, we said, was a system which was composed of a multiplicity of different levels, reference to each of which was necessary in order to understand or give an adequate account of the phenomena in question. So there are different types of laminated systems that we formulated, and the model of four-planar social being that I've already referred to, and the seven-tier model of a social being, the seven levels of scale. Those are forms of laminated system, as well as the particular model we introduced, in which we argued that reference to physical, to biological, to psychological, to socio-economic, and to socio-cultural and normative features were all necessary in a typical case of disability, that they were all necessary for it. That was the model that we introduced. There are others, models of laminated system, including one involving overlapping spatiotemporalities, that there's no time to go into here. So much for the ontology of interdisciplinarity. Epistemologically, we argued that what was important in any interdisciplinary context was a form of transdisciplinarity in which we could creatively exploit cognitive resources from different fields, as creative natural scientists do when they're model building. And two other things we said were absolutely essential. The first of this was cross-disciplinary understanding. That is the capacity of me as a sociologist to understand what you as a geographer or a geologist are saying, and vice versa. This cross-disciplinary understanding is something which is very difficult to achieve in practice, but it's absolutely essential for interdisciplinary work. And then the final step is effective epistemic integration. And these two moves at an epistemological level in interdisciplinarity, these two moves are underpinned by, can be underpinned by two principles from the philosophy of meta-reality that I'll go into in our third session, principles called universal solidarity and axial rationality. Universal solidarity says it's always in principle possible to understand anyone else, and axial rationality says that where you have a conflict or dispute between parties, it's always possible to arrive at an optimal resolution of it. So those principles give a bit of hope for good interdisciplinary work. However, there are huge obstacles to it at the moment, and these obstacles pose serious problems to coming up with effective solutions in relation to climate change. For instance, where one has typically the great difficulty that people trained in the arts and humanities and the social sciences find in understanding the natural sciences and vice versa. Even more a problem is the existence of economics as a science which appears to be closed to other sciences, other social sciences, and this is something that can only be transformed by the imminent development of such a science. One could compare this with the difficulties of working in an interdisciplinary team when there are surgeons and consultant surgeons and social workers in the same team, because the existing status hierarchies are so tilted in favor of the consultant surgeon that they will not typically pay sufficient account of the views of social workers and nurses and physiotherapists, and of course the patient themselves and their families, all of whom are equally necessary to the healing of the problem. And generally, the pathos of the interdisciplinary predicament can be seen by the fact that in interdisciplinary work we are dealing with an integrated problem with disintegrated sciences and disciplines. We need a comparable level of integration in our thought and action to achieve effective responses to many of the applied problems we face in the world today. Now, I would just say that in dealing with, I could just briefly list, as we're slightly running out of time now, there are a number of conditions for successful and for a transformation in the prospects for interdisciplinary work. The first condition is to clearly disambiguate ontological and epistemological questions, because typically in the interdisciplinary context, the same thing will be being referred to in different ways by members of different disciplines or language communities or professions. Secondly, a second principle is anti-reductionism. And the third is using a laminated system to construct a multiplicity, an effective totality of the generative levels or mechanisms that you're concerned with. The fourth would be adherence to what I call the Holy Trinity of interdisciplinary research. And this involves a meta-theoretical unity, a methodological specificity, and a theoretical pluralism and tolerance. Then moving on, the fifth would be the removal of the huge career, social, financial, administrative barriers to interdisciplinary research. Then we would be getting science capable of dealing with open systemic phenomena. There's much more to be said here, particularly about the moving away from what you have in the UK and many other societies, a two cultures world, and moving to a world where someone whose prime orientation is in humanities or social sciences is also at home in the world of numbers and figures, and vice versa. And that will involve educational changes. Now, by way of conclusion today, I'd like to sum up and talk about what I see as the advantages of critical realism. So what critical realism aspires to be is, in short, maximally inclusive. Thus, for the critical realist, everything is real. Everything which is a causal agent is real. Thus, for a critical realist, beliefs which are false are also, in virtue of being causally efficacious, real. For a critical realist, language is real. Mathematics is real. Materiality is real. Whatever has a causal effect is real. And that gives a critical realist a maximally inclusive ontology. At the same time, at an epistemological level, critical realists try to point out how at different stages of the scientific process, different kinds of methods are called for, and how in relation to different objects of study, such as people on the one hand, or molecules on the other, you will have different methods. The first different stages, it could be illustrated by the DREIC model, and of course the second could be illustrated by our acceptance of the absolute necessity for a hermeneutic moment in science, social science. So that's the first advantage of critical realism. The second advantage is that every other theory of science or social science or practice of critique is susceptible to huge criticisms. These are either aporia which are endemic to the philosophy, such as the problem of induction is to empiricism and neo-Kantianism, or they are susceptible to criticisms that the critical realists can bring to bear on them, such as in the case of the idea that language is the only thing, only important thing to study in the social world. Social constructivist idea is subject to huge critical realist critiques, turning around how do you have a language without reference? Is it possible to imagine meaning as just a relation between signifier and signified? No, the critical realist says you have to have a reference. And that constitutes a huge sort of critique of the social constructivist position, of the beginning of it. Now, one particular form of criticism, which I call Achilles' heel critique, is very strong, where the criticism turns on the very point that the system of philosophy feels strongest in. So this might be like empiricism in relation to experimental activity. You might say, well, you know, you're against me everywhere else, but here I'm strong. And critical realism says, no, that is where you're actually weakest. And that's a very strong form of criticism. The third point to make here is that extraordinarily, the actual other systems, insofar as they survive, insofar as they can cope with reality, have to use critical realism. So that their practice is what I call a Tina formation. It is a combination of a practice which will make do in virtue of using an implicit critical realism and a false theory which appears to steer it. And when you think about this, critical realism offers to adherents of such philosophies a very inviting future, because what we say is, you know, recognize your implicit practice, recognize what you're really doing to make this thing seem to work for you. And when you recognize that, you will gradually throw off the false meta theory and develop further, and in a more rationally self-conscious way, the exciting nugget of truth in your theory. And so we say to everyone, in an age when if you study a social science, you also study inevitably philosophy, become philosophically, methodologically self-conscious, and choose to be ex ante, before you begin your research or your investigation, a critical realist. And this is what I've called the critical realist embrace. So you don't have to actually be a critical realist to come on board. Just come on board, and if you think that language is the most important thing in the social world, welcome. You know, you're welcome. We have no objection to anything positively you say. We would only have an objection if you try and stop someone else, say, who thought that class or inequality was the most important thing in the social world, doing what they wanted to do. So it's a welcome to all to come on board, enjoy the critical realist embrace, and we will learn and develop further by working with you. Because, of course, the last thing that the critical realist wants to say is that they have a monopoly of a truth or an interesting positions. So there is much you can learn from non-critical realists, but I suggest critical realism will always be the meta-theory that you need to use to get the most out of these other systems and philosophies and thinkers. So that's where we'll end today on what I hope will be seen as a... Sorry? Gary?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. That's where we'll end today. Is that all right?
That's fine, thank you. Yes, Roy. That is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope to feel you all on the 24th of May. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. I've opened the chat room if people would like to make any comment or anything, or you can leave questions as well. I've saved questions that people put down in the break, and we will return to those on the 24th of May. I can see that there's lots of people sending questions, which is great, and also you all welcome to your goodbyes as well. One of the reasons we wanted to do these conversations is that there is an international conference on critical realism taking place here on the 18th to the 24th of July, and Roy will also be running an Introduction to Critical Realism weekend just before the conference. If you can make it, that would be great. On the 16th and 17th.
2 days to discuss these topics. Thank you for mentioning that, Gary.
That's okay.
Completely forgot. But on the 16th and 17th, I think that's a Wednesday and Thursday, there will be an introductory workshop on critical realism. We will be, on day one, we'll be doing basic and applied critical realism. So it'll be a sort of expansion of what you've been hearing this afternoon, but a fully interactive expansion. And then on day two, we'll be doing dialectical critical realism and meta-reality.
Brilliant. A couple of people are asking about video recordings.